Welcome everyone. We're going to wait, I think, just maybe another minute or so before starting. Hi, Matt. Andrew, I don't see you, but I'm really glad you're here. It's nice to, yeah, actually, I won't reveal the secret just yet. Oh, Ryan's here. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Mel.
And welcome to everyone else who I haven't met yet. I'm super excited that you're able to join us today. Just so everyone knows, I think you get a little warning when you log in, but we're going to be recording the talk today, and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. All right, maybe we'll just start. Are we good, Crystal, to get going? Okay, well, thank you everyone for making time today to join the Environmental Media Lab and our second graduate scholar in residence, Felix Loftus. I'm Mel Hogan. I'm the director of the EML, which is based at the University of Calgary. And I work closely with Crystal Choksi, who I think many of you are familiar with. You know, Crystal's the one who keeps this lab running very smoothly. So thank you, Crystal, as always. So we had launched this grad scholar in residence program last year. And one of the major objectives was to facilitate the kind of connections and conversations between junior scholars in particular, and we like to do that across institutions and across borders. So I hope I'm welcoming people from all over today. And we're lucky to have Felix presenting a talk titled Conjuring Landscapes. So you can read the title for yourself: Folk Histories, Environmental Photography, and Tech Design. In his talk, Felix will give an overview and reflection on his research methodology for his piece Conjuring Landscapes, which is a sound and motion sensing computational camera. The piece was developed for a specific location, which is Dartmoor in the UK. And this was designed through a decolonial reading of a folk story from the area, which was guided by Catherine McKittrick's analysis of imperial geographic techniques in demonic grounds. Conjuring Landscapes is one in a series of photographic projects that experiments with alternative modes of environmental photography that are engaged in movements towards de-enclosure in the UK. Felix is pursuing his MA in computational arts at Goldsmiths in London, UK. His work is concerned with human relations to the land, to food, and to more than human life. He's also interested in how these relations are entangled with colonial and imperial logics, and how creative practitioners can use storytelling and speculative creative methods for upsetting these oppressive structures. So following Felix's talk, which will be approximately 25 minutes, we'll reserve about 10 to 15 for Q&A with the goal of supporting Felix's work. So Felix, thank you, and over to you.
Cool, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hi, so I'm Felix, and today I'll be giving a talk, which is largely a reflection on my practice of developing alternative modes of environmental photography and the research methodology that I've been working with at the moment, which has been engaging with folk histories to gain a kind of sense of landscape in the places that I've been photographing. By environmental photography, I'm kind of talking about photography of the land and of other species. And I see environmental photography as kind of encompassing the fields of nature and landscape photography. Although I see kind of nature and landscape photography as kind of genres of environmental photography where they have specific styles. So I've been trying to develop through making cameras kind of alternative styles of environmental photography that kind of aim to better improve people's understanding of landscape. So this talk is loosely taken from a written piece I did for the critical computing blog Engines of Difference. And that piece was a provocation for these alternative modes of photography. And then the piece that I'll be taking you through, Conjuring Landscape, is kind of an outcome of that written piece. That was me taking up the kind of provocation that I've written. And kind of, as it will become apparent, like the kind of reasons why I think there need to be kind of new modes of environmental photography are largely based on kind of decolonial, anti-imperial, post-humanist and feminist analysis of imaging technologies in techno-capitalism, which I'll detail later in the talk. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of note at the start of the talk that I don't see myself as kind of a lone figure working in this field of generating alternative modes in environmental photography. I'm kind of inspired by other practitioners working at the moment, but mostly people working in analog photography, and in particular a group called the Sustainable Darkroom, who are kind of looking into creating modes of analog photography that use kind of materials from a landscape to develop photographs. Don't use any kind of imported materials to generate photographs. Cool, so I'll move on to the piece, which I think I have to click. Cool, so this is a still from the piece. So this is the kind of central camera in my piece. So yeah, I've decided today that I'll start with kind of, giving an overview of how this piece works before kind of untangling how it got there through my research methodology. As Mel mentioned, this is a camera that is both sound sensing and motion sensing. And through it being sound sensing and motion sensing, it is kind of controlled by other species, and there's no one true kind of photographer in the system. To explain that, I've made a little diagram, which I'll take you through. So there are three main components of this setup in Conjuring landscapes. The first is something that happens in front of the camera, which is a wire to hang objects. In this iteration of the piece, I was hanging kind of engraved photos from the landscape that I was photographing in the piece. And people could choose from a series of photos to hang in front of the camera. Then the second component of this piece is a sound sensor and a motion sensor, which were placed kind of within, outside of the room that I was taking photos from. That was picking up any motion in the landscape, any environmental noises, and then it was sending that sound and data to a camera module and a microcomputer that are working together. And when there was more noise in the landscape, the more images would be sent to the microcomputer from the camera module to build up a more dense and chaotic image. And when there was less sound, there would be kind of, the image would appear more like what you were looking at in front of you. Cool. So through this piece, I wanted to experiment with an alternative photographic verb. So instead of capturing or taking a landscape, which I see as kind of generally just representing the landscape from how it looks from human vision, I wanted to try and generate a landscape through a system. So I chose conjuring as my verb through working with a folk story from the area that I was looking at, Dartmoor. And this system is actually inspired by a witch from Dartmoor, from a story, Vixiana, the witch of Vixen Tor. And this is, the witch in the story is someone who lived in tune with their surroundings without trying to dominate them. And through this talk, I will try to explain why I chose to create a camera with this witch in mind, and why this kind of connects to my project of trying to create photographies of de-enclosure. Cool. So I'll start. Hopefully this makes sense to people, and I can move on to Vixiana, who is the main inspiration here. Oh, cool. I've also put some kind of images that have been generated through the system. So the landscape that this was pointed at generally from a human perspective looked quite still, and through this image system I could kind of bring it to life a bit through the sounds that were ongoing. And here's the picture of some of the slides that people could hang in front of the camera. And I think it's worth noting that this is the first iteration of this camera that I did under lockdown conditions, and the actual kind of plan for it is to take it outside, and rather than use pre-made images like these images here, people can hang actual objects in front of the camera, so they can generate a landscape not only from the kind of ambient landscape in front of them, but also from objects that they see as important in that landscape. Cool. Did I miss one? No. Okay, cool. So this story, Vixiana the Witch, I'll first outline it for you. I won't go through the whole story, and then explain why I found it interesting with regard to environmental photography. So the story of Vixiana the Witch goes something like this. It goes that there was a kind of standardly evil, ugly witch that lived on Dartmoor and had lived there for time immemorial. When, as people got older, became grandparents, the witch didn't. She stayed the exact same, and she had presumably been living there forever. There's no kind of sense of when she became the Witch of Vixen Tor. And she lived around this tor. Tor means rock kind of structure. And on Dartmoor, there are lots of different tors. This one people think is named Vixen Tor because it somewhat resembles a face, I think down here on the face. And this witch, apart from just living on the land, she apparently liked killing people. So when fog came in to Dartmoor, Dartmoor is a marshland. So there's this kind of, it's mostly grassland and bog. And so there's quite often fogs that surround quite large expanses of Dartmoor. And supposedly this witch, when the fog came in, she would start to call out to anyone who was traveling by. And she would lure travelers towards them who had got lost, saying that there was safety with where she was. And she kept calling and calling until eventually they lost the track of their way and they fell into the bog. Or she would push them into the bog. And so the witch was apparently a problem for the people who lived around Dartmoor. And one day a man decided he was going to sort this problem out. And so he luckily had earned a favor from these magical beings that live on Dartmoor, the Piskies. He'd earned a favor that he redeemed from them. And when he redeemed his favor from them, he was given two gifts, which are gifts that became very important in my development of my camera. These are the gifts of invisibility. He could, once he had spoken to the Piskies, he could become invisible when he wanted to. And these are the gifts of clarity of vision. So once he had spoken to the Piskies, he could see through the fog completely. And so he decided he would use these gifts or technologies, tools, whatever you'd like to call them, to murder the witch and bring an end to the supposed kind of terror she was bringing down on the tour. So he waited for a day when it got foggy, and then went out traveling close to the tour and waited for the witch's call. And as you can probably imagine, he waits for the witch's call, but he sees through the bog. He follows the witch, and then he follows her onto the top of Vixen Tor. And then he doesn't follow her onto the top of Vixen Tor. He follows her through the bog, making sure not to fall into it. And then he pushes her into the bog, and he manages to kill her. And once he does that, the fog disperses and he sits on top of Vixen Tor, and a supposed calm has come across the land once he's done that. Cool. So I found this story when I was researching into this place, Dartmoor. I wanted to photograph this place, but I didn't want to just kind of photograph it from, I wanted to have more of a connection to the land. And I decided that the way I was going to try and connect to this land was to connect with the stories from that area. And Dartmoor is a really significant place for folk stories. There's lots kind of in this area, but it's also a really significant place in England in terms of enclosure and in terms of the land. It became interesting to me because it's the only place in England where you are allowed to camp wildly. So the rights to the land in the UK have become so diminished that we kind of need permits to camp, and this is the only place where someone can camp wildly. So I was thinking about how to photograph this area, and I stumbled upon this story. And I found that this story maps really well onto stories about the advent of techno-capitalism and the technologies that organize the world in techno-capitalism. So in particular, I think this should be my next slide. This maps really well onto some of the analysis in Catherine McKittrick's Demonic Grounds, Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledges, and Joanna Zielinska's work in non-human photography. So I'm going to kind of make a leap here by saying that, well, I made a leap when I was developing this by thinking that the man is representative of the tools of techno-capitalism. Cool. So I'll read out this quote, which I think, and then try and say how I think it relates to the story. So the quote says, "The term traditional geography points to formulations that assume we can view, assess, and ethically organize the world from a stable, white, patriarchal, Eurocentric, heterosexual, class vantage point. While these formulations, cartographic, positivist, imperialist, have been retained and resisted within and beyond the discipline of human geography, they also clarify that Black women are negotiating a geographic landscape that is upheld by a legacy of exploitation, exploration, and conquest." So hopefully, you'll already see a parallel here of the position or perspective that Catherine McKittrick is referring to, and the perspective of the man once he has kind of dominated the landscape and killed Vixiana the witch. So in this kind of analysis, traditional geography purports to be the unitary, stable, or objective way to organize the world. And this is enabled through technological apparatus, from the exclusionary social technology of the academy, governmental organizations, and corporate surveyors, to the material techno-scientific technology of sensors, models, and photographs used for cartographic purposes and for creating surveys and official records, to the literary technology that disperses the products as hegemonic. So here I decided to work with kind of Catherine McKittrick's analysis of traditional geography, because I see photography as a field that has kind of enabled the perspective or the ideas of landscape that traditional geography has created. And you can also see a similar kind of analysis when looking at the history of photography in colonial America and the use in the 19th century of photography to kind of assert a particular perspective of what were the important parts of the landscape. And we see this in a piece, Photography in the White Gaze. And this was interesting for me because I wanted to think of ways to kind of represent landscapes differently from different perspectives than this perspective of techno-capitalism. Cool. So there's a similar quote in Haraway, which says, "I would like to insist on the embodied nature of all vision and so reclaim the sensory system that has been used to signify a leap out of the marked body and into a conquering gaze from nowhere. This is the gaze that mythically inscribes all the unmarked bodies that make the unmarked category claim the power to see and not be seen, to represent while escaping." So for me, this kind of, again, has a strong parallel with the position of the man on top of Vixen Tor. He can both see the Tor as the way he wants it to be seen, but he's also cannot be seen. Has this conquering gaze from nowhere. And this is a gaze which will kind of assert a power dynamic or an oppressive power dynamic that of course we want to resist. So here I'm thinking of landscape as a dynamic process of creating meaning rather than just being what is in front of us. So now I'll try and kind of go from this man, his perspective being the perspective of capitalist modernity, onto how this maps onto our ideas of place and how we photograph a place and how photography creates meaning about a place. So I've got two photos that for me kind of, they're quite useful for me in thinking of how our ideas of place are sort of, they are seen from a similar perspective to this man who needs to kind of eradicate alternative ways of living in order to feel safe in that landscape. So on the left, there's a photograph that anyone who has flown into the UK would have probably seen this kind of view, which is a view of the UK from above, kind of just below London, close to the South Downs. And here is a view that people kind of refer to as like a patchwork of fields, a beautiful patchwork of fields. And people kind of use this view as a way to think of Britain as a really pretty, amazing place. But what's underlying this photo is that actually this is a photo of kind of privatized land. This is an image of enclosure. So each of the smaller fields have been were kind of created like that through movements to enclosure. And in those movements to enclosure, land that people had common rights to grow on, common rights to graze on, was privatized. Hedgerows were built up along the common land and fences were made. And so through this kind of image of Britain being pretty because of these fields, the kind of history of enclosure is glossed over. And in a way, I think this is reflective of this story, in that the man completely changes people's way of life. So capitalist modernity changes people's way of life by enclosing commons and stopping people being able to live off the land. And so people have to move towards the city to be able to make enough food to live. And so when we look at this view and think of it as a pretty view and not much more than that, we're sort of looking through the perspective of the man from the story, or at least that's how I was thinking about it when I was making this camera. And in the second image, this is an image that kind of has stuck with me from a trip that I did to Dartmoor last year, going walking on Dartmoor. And I was thinking about how to represent this landscape. And we were sat at a pub after walking for a while, and there was a man who had just a t-shirt on, a Boston Red Sox cap, that was it. And then on his kind of upper arm, he just had one singular tattoo, which presumably was really important for his identity. And that tattoo was the state border of Massachusetts. And I'd like to think of that image of a state border inscribed in flesh as a landscape image that is enabled by photographic imaging. So through satellite imagery, we get this stable perspective of place through which the kind of borders can be superimposed onto landscape and appear fixed. They appear like they are the landscape. And through that, kind of landscape gets out, or I think this helps as a kind of analogy to show how landscape can get reduced to kind of figures such as borders, rather than the particularities of place, and rather than being a kind of dynamic relationship with the place. So I think this connects up really well with Joanna Zielinska's call in non-human photography for a new version of photography that she calls non-human, which is photography. So Joanna Zielinska is kind of a post-humanist writer who's writing about ways to reconnect with other species. And for her, photography is one way of doing so. So Zielinska says that embracing non-human vision as both a concept and a mode of being in the world will allow humans to see beyond the humanist limitations of their current philosophies and worldviews, to unsee themselves in their godlike positioning of both everywhere and nowhere, and to become re-anchored and reattached again. Cool. So for me, these previous ideas of landscape, and for Zielinska, these previous ideas of landscape and the technologies that we use to create them were not adequate. And if we are to reconnect with landscape, then tech design, new technologies, new ways of representing landscape could be needed. So I had this question, this is kind of my research question: how can we create new modes of environmental photography, modes that re-engage us with the land, and modes that kind of recognize the need for better land arrangements that will allow people to kind of have common rights to land. And I thought that rather than start afresh and just start making new imaging technologies, I would continue to work with this story, to continue to work with Vixiana, the witch. And so instead of making a photography that was kind of reflective of the perspective of the man in the story, I returned to Vixiana, and I thought I started to ask, how would she understand her landscape? How did she manage to live on that land for generations and generations, never dying? How did she live with the bog and the fog and not die? And these were the kind of key questions that I used to develop my piece, Conjuring Landscapes. And I started thinking that well, if she was kind of covered over with fog really often, then vision might not have been adequate to compose her idea of landscape, and what she heard would have become really important. So her kind of idea of landscape was created not just through her visual apparatus, but also through her audio. And so that's why I kind of implemented this sound sensor onto the camera, and that's kind of meant to be meant to reflect how she would have understood her landscape. And it's also kind of an idea that I don't think I would have come to without having engaged with the story and then thought through how she would have understood that landscape. So this process threw up quite a lot of thought to me on how to approach tech design, and rather than and how kind of impactful it could be to engage with folk histories when thinking about place, because there's kind of knowledge, so much knowledge within the stories about a place that will allow us to kind of understand the place without using the techniques of traditional geography that Catherine McKittrick refers to, kind of surveys, maps. For me, I realized that we can understand a place as much through stories as through those techniques, and those stories might allow us to kind of draw out alternative ideas of place that might further kind of embed us in place. And this also threw up this alternative photographic verb, which I think was quite exciting for me, because the language of photography is still kind of reflects the technological, the kind of optics of domination, and the Catherine McKittrick talks of. We capture or take a photograph, and in that we're kind of imposing a certain sense of what that landscape is. Whereas while working with Vixiana, I could think about how to understand the landscape through not just taking it, but through bringing significant things together into a whole and generating something new each time. Cool. So yeah, I wanted to kind of finish just with returning to the system, and then talking a little bit through my kind of reflections from this work. But hopefully, I think I've explained kind of how this connects up to the story. And yeah, another kind of outcome from this was the kind of work to destabilize kind of hegemonic photographic technologies, is that the system here that kind of came out of this story, in this system, there's no one clear photographer. And it kind of destabilizes the relationship between the photographed and the photographer, because it's not like I'm completely the photographer by programming the camera. It's not like the person putting these sheets in front of the camera is completely the photographer. And it's not really like the sounds in the landscape themselves of the photographer. So instead, it's kind of introduced this idea for me as like multi-agent photography, which I think could be a good way to kind of reintegrate with species in a landscape. And yeah, finally, I thought that this research methodology of engaging with stories from the landscape could contribute quite well and run in parallel with the field of speculative design, where people kind of design technology based on writing speculative fiction and trying to imagine how the world might be in the future and how we could design for the future now. And I think, I quite like the parallel of this, of still kind of thinking about how to design for the future now, but also engaging with past folk understandings of landscape. Cool. So I think I've finished there, and I'm sure there'll be bits that you'll have questions on, because I ran through everything quite quick. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, please go for it.
Thank you so much, Felix. I am happy to facilitate questions if people want to put them in the chat, or better yet, just unmute yourself and ask something. I just want to say, Felix, like what I so appreciate about your work is sort of this really thoughtful, gentle approach to research that I think is not, it's not something we see all the time. And I think the way that you articulate sort of the thoughtfulness of your trajectory is remarkable. Like it's like kind of unlike anything I've seen. So that really stood out to me. I have a bunch of questions, but I want to see here. So in the chat, it says, this is Bethany Barar, who says, this reminds me of those who insist that we speak of making, not taking photographs, in how photography requires natural elements, such as light, in more traditional modes of photographic practice. So it's not exactly a question, but I don't know if you want to respond to that comment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's something that Joanna Zielinska writes about as well. Seeing photography not as a process that just kind of hardens our human kind of perspective, but one that is zoetic. I think that's the word she used. Like it's a life-bringing process that can generate alternative ways of understanding our environment. And yeah, I think kind of engaging with alternative modes of photography, it becomes more clear that kind of the images we create are made, not just taken. And yeah, definitely agree with that perspective.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Does anyone else have questions? Crystal, are you jumping in? Or Kate? We'll let Kate first. All right, Kate, go for it.
Oh, hi. Hi. I'm so grateful to be able to hear your talk. That was really excellent. Thanks. It's exciting, fun. And I have a goofy, because it's goofily exciting to me as a media studies person. And I have a goofy media theory question. And it's totally goofy media theory. It's what about time? So like in that story, I heard you say that you said she had been on the tour since time immemorial. And I'm wondering if this camera or a camera has a way to conceptualize time that isn't a colonial technocratic imposition, much like our historical time, right, is a colonial technocratic imposition. Is there a different magical time? Like, because when I hear that, I hear her death as a story that employs historical time, right? Like she dies at a time because that technology imposes that. But somewhere in her time immemorial, she's always there. That's a really goofy question.
Yeah, I think I've got a few thoughts on that. I guess one way is just in the tech design that I've been doing. I think having the like the images that are created, if I can get them up. Oh, I won't go back the whole way through, but the images that are created kind of are slowly amassing over time. But I think connecting it to some non-human or more than human element kind of breaks up a human perspective of time, because it's the kind of time trace that comes out on the image isn't a kind of human controlled one. It's controlled by kind of some other process. And it's something that I'm trying to work on more in the next kind of iteration of the camera, is how to represent the kind of activities of the other species in the landscape as it goes, but also how to represent time. And I think for me, quite a lot is about like layering. So I think that's one answer to that. And then the other, maybe less to do with photography, but thing that I got kind of interested in through the story was the bug, which is also really connected to time. And the way the man kills the witch in the story is pushing her into the bog. And bugs, like it's a peat bog, which is a preservative, or is that the right word? It preserves whatever's in it. So in like Ireland, they found lots of kind of villages completely preserved across time because they've been submerged in a bog. So I was thinking in the story, the way like the bog kind of represents kind of the kind of abyss of time of that techno-capitalism can't understand, and the only way to get rid of the witch is to kind of put her into that abyss that they can't understand. But she's still preserved, so she's still there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. That's such a great question.
Yeah,
There's Chris, I don't know if you want to jump in. There's also a comment by Matt Parker. Matt, you want me to read it if you put it in the chat, but please jump in if you want to do a better job than I'm about to do reading this. It says, thank you, Felix. Oh, you're in. Okay, perfect. Go ahead, Matt.
I'm in. Hey, hi, Felix. Yeah, I can read this out again. Thank you, Felix. That's really cool. I missed the Twitter event discussing Vixiana a few weeks ago. I was really intrigued in your work. And I was interested in what you were talking just now about this sort of like alternative modes of image making or photography, and thinking about like spectral approaches to image capture. Yeah, just sort of wondering what your take on like the ideas of like multispectral photography, mostly because this is something that I'm interested in my work at the moment, but as part of like understanding image making as like this sort of thing where you're producing like particularly in photography, or like classic photography is like really kind of capturing a very limited frequency band of what is, you know, in like the Dunn and Rabi, who kind of mentioned at the end there, talk about Hertzian space. It's like much, you know, like we're kind of just looking at these very small kind of narrow bandwidths all the time, whether it's in sound or visual work. But, you know, multi-species kind of life worlds are interested in frequencies that go way beyond our own sensory perceptions, I guess. And
yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting kind of area to look into, and it's something I'm also trying to work with at the moment with I think if I'm understanding you right, this fits quite well. I've been trying to work with an infrared sensor to do photography, but also looking at kind of ultrasonic data as well. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting way of decentering and destabilizing human perspectives on environment by just showing that there's so many alternative kind of events that are happening constantly around us that we're just missing. So yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's something that I'm trying to do practically through a new camera. And yeah, I think it fits with the project really well. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Also on the Etch-a-Sketch thing that you mentioned, yeah, I'd use they're like e-ink screens. So it is similar to an Etch-a-Sketch, kind of like a Kindle. But I've been using them because they're they draw much less power because you only have to turn them on to change them. So the plan with these cameras is to actually take them outside and have them connected to solar power, so they can just be continuously making landscape images in a place over however long they're installed, without having to kind of continuously charge them up. So yeah, that's why all my pieces basically use e-paper.
All right, thank you, Matt, and for the question. And I feel a potential collaboration brewing there. Ryan, do you want to?
I'd love to hear about yours.
Yeah, great, thanks. Thanks a lot. I have first is kind of like a small technical question. So I know there's sensors working in the apparatus here. Does that mean that the exposure is triggered automatically by the sensors, or does someone have to physically take the picture?
It's automatic. So the camera is controlled by Raspberry Pi microcomputer. The sound sensor is just sending data via OSC messaging, so on a local network. And once So I've coded this some different ways, but basically it kind of adds, when new sounds are triggered, it adds new frames to a composite image. Does that make sense? So yeah, there's no physical control.
Yeah, so the takeaway is that that the images are generated automatically.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about how that sits with your choice of verb in Conjuring, because Conjuring it's an alchemical act, but it's also very much an intentional act, right? Like a waterfall doesn't conjure things. Like conjuring has to be done by either like a human agent or by some sort of anthropomorphic agent, like a spirit or god or something. So kind of given your interest in photography as a specifically creative kind of process, a conjuring process, why is it important that the system automatically generate its images? Another way to ask this is to ask, how can a system conjure things?
Yeah, so the way I was thinking of it being conjuring was that the kind of non-human control would continue. That was a more continuous process that would change based on the ambient noises, but the kind of human interaction with the system would be to take in significant objects from the landscape and incorporate them into the landscape image. So that is the kind of the section in front of the camera is the bit that I saw as the conjuring, in the humans are, so in this, people are just taking frames that I'd made, but if this was on location, the idea is that people could walk, or if they knew the landscape well, they would have objects that they wanted to be included in an image of that landscape, and so they would be adding them to the image, but they wouldn't have complete control over how they would be added. That would be given off to non-human actors. And so I kind of saw that as reflective of that for Conjuring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and is much more interesting than anything that I had in mind. So there's a sort of like ecosystem dyad going on with the humans who are doing something to the camera, or like doing something in front of the camera, but there's also tech going on behind the scenes that's interacting with it in strange ways. Yeah,
and I was thinking about, like, I was using the definition of conjuring of like creating, or I have it up somewhere. I think creating something magical through a ritual or a spell. I was seeing the programming, the code system as that. That's the kind of code, the spell in the Conjuring. Whereas the people are doing the more physical moving around in the Conjuring. Hopefully that kind of adds to that.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that question, Ryan. Your questions are always so good. And thank you, Felix. Thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions and for engaging. And I really hope, Felix, that this was helpful for moving your project along. And so if you want to continue the conversation, you can reach out to us on Twitter or to Felix directly. You can look up at the Environmental Media Lab handle, or just email me if you need me to relay anything or you want to continue the conversation. And you'll see also that we will publish a piece by Felix in Heliotrope, which is the journal that comes out of the EML. So we will definitely circulate and publicize that widely. So thank you again, Felix, and thank you to all of you for coming out today. And I hope you have a good week and good weekend. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.